Hello, third grade scientists. Nice to see you guys again. I hope you're having a great day. Today, I have a really interesting experiment for you. So, I have two different oranges. One looks like this, and one looks like this. What do you guys notice about the two different oranges? What's different about them? Now, you should see that this orange, it still has skin, and this orange doesn't. That means it's peeled. So, I want you to think about what would happen if I placed these two oranges in water. If I placed this orange in one cup and this orange in another cup. What do you think would happen? Do you think the same thing would happen? Or do you think something different would happen? Well, we're about to find out. So first, I'm going to take the orange with its skin on, and we're going to put it in a cup. And we can see what's happening to it. Think about that. And then I'm going to take my peeled orange, and I'm going to put that in my cup. And you can see what's happening with that one. What do you guys notice about the two different oranges once they're put in water? I noticed that one of them's on top of the water while the other one went to the bottom of the water. Do you guys know the names of what that's called? What's it called when something sits on top of the water? Right, that's called it floats. And if something goes to the bottom of the water, what is it called? Sinks. You're right. So now we're going to do another experiment to talk about what things we think will sink and what things we think will float. We're also going to find out what made the orange with the skin float, but the orange without the skin sink. What do you think's different about them that made them float versus sink, even though it's the same piece of fruit? Don't you think the same thing would happen? We're going to find out. So, I want you to get out your worksheet that says, will it sink or float? And on the sheet it says, predict. Circle the items you think will float if placed in water. Put a square around the items you think will sink. So we have all of these different items, and I'm going to go over them with you so you know what they are. So the first picture is a water bottle. The second is a metal spoon. Pay attention to the word metal. Then we have a plastic spoon. Pay attention to the word plastic. We have a dry erase marker. We have a paper plate. We have an empty soda can. We have coins. We have a pencil. We have keys, a sponge, a cap that would go on usually medicine or vitamins, something like that, a metal bracelet, a cork, an eraser, sunglasses, nail polish, a magnet, a top of a soda can, like when you pop open the soda can, the tops of those, and some glue, just a glue stick. So again, I want you to circle the things that you think will float and put a box around the items you think will sink. I'll give you 1 second to do that, and then we're going to test out and see what actually happens. Okay, now that you've had some time to think about it, we're going to go over these different items, and we're going to see what sinks and what floats. Okay, so first we're going to test our sponge. What did you think would happen to that? Let's find out. As you can see, our sponge is floating on the water. Next, we're going to do the sunglasses. Now, I want you to think. Have you ever been in the pool and your sunglasses fell off? What happened? Did they sink to the bottom, or did they float on the top so you could just easily get them? Let's find out. The sunglasses sink to the bottom of the bin. So be careful whenever you're swimming, because you could lose your sunglasses and then you might not be able to get them back. Okay, so next. we're going to do a coin. See this coin? You can use any kind of coin. I'm using a quarter, but you can use a penny, a nickel, or a dime. It will all work the same. Think about what you think will happen. And it sinks to the bottom. The coin will sink, no matter what type of coin you put in. Okay. Let's try this cork. What do you think is going to happen to the cork? Do you think it's going to sink, or do you think it's going to float? The cork floats on top of the water. Okay. Awesome. So let's try something different. Let's try the plastic spoon. Now remember, I have two different types of spoons. So this one is the plastic one. Let's see what happens to the plastic spoon. As you can see, the plastic spoon is floating on top of the water. Interesting. Let's find out what happens to the metal spoon. Do you think the metal spoon is going to be different, or it's going to be the same? Do you think it will also float, or do you think maybe it will sink? It will be different. Let's find out. The metal spoon sinks right to the bottom of the bin. Interesting. What do you think makes those two spoons different? Okay. Now I have a metal bracelet, and we're going to see what happens to this bracelet when I place it in the water. As you can see, the bracelet sinks right to the bottom. Think about why that happens. Now I have the cap that would go on your medicine or your vitamins. We're going to place it like this into the water, and it floats. Now some of you might be thinking, well, maybe you have to put it the other way for it to sink. So let's find out. If I place it the other way, it also floats. So no matter which way I put it, it floats. Now I have some nail polish. What do you think will happen to the nail polish? Do you think it will sink? Do you think it will float? Nail polish sinks to the bottom. Okay. Now I have a magnet. You can use any type of magnet, but I used a magnet from my fridge. The magnet sinks right to the bottom, falls right to the bottom of the bin. Okay. Now I have my keys. What do you think is going to happen to my keys? My keys sink right to the bottom, so that's another thing. Be careful if you or anybody you know ever has keys out, because if you lose them in the water, you might not be able to find them again. Now I have a dry erase marker. Let's see what happens to this. Even though the dry erase marker is long, it floats on top of the water. Let's see if the same thing will happen with our pencil. And as you can see, the pencil also floats. Now we only have a couple more things left. We have our eraser. What do you think is going to happen to our eraser? It sinks. Okay. Now we have a small bobby pin. Do you think the bobby pin is going to sink or float? The bobby pin sinks. Notice that even though it's small, it does sink. Even though it's small and light, it does sink. Now we have a top to your soda can. And that also sinks to the bottom. Finally, we have a plate. This is a paper plate. And we're going to see what happens if we place it in the water. Do you think it's going to sink or float? And the plate floats. Interesting, because the plate is big. I wonder why it floats. So now we're going to find out what decides if something sinks or floats. I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about it, but I want you to think about it. What types of materials sank and what types of materials floated? What similarities and differences do they have? What do you think decides if something sinks or floats? We're going to find out. Okay, now that we got a chance to see some things that sink and float, we're going to talk about what makes something sink and what makes something float. So how do we know something will sink or float? There's this thing called density, and density is what determines if an object will sink or float. All non-living things, they're made out of molecules. Now, if these molecules are packed close together and they're really tight, then the item is more dense. If these molecules are packed more loosely together or they're far apart, the item is less dense. So here's a picture for you guys to understand a little bit more. This picture here on the left, this is showing you an item that is less dense. See how the molecules are all spread apart and they're not packed close together. Where on the right, this item is dense. It's more dense. And you can see that the items are packed really closely together and they're tight. Okay, so if an item is less dense than water, it will float. But if it's more dense than water, it will sink. So if the item is less packed, like we've seen in this previous picture, if it looks like this, it's going to float. Where if it looks like this, it's going to sink. So from our activity, here's some of the items that we found that float, and here are the items we found that sink. And the items that float, they float because they are less dense than water. And the items that sink are more dense than water. So it doesn't necessarily matter how much something weighs, it matters how much density it has. So keep that in mind. Doesn't necessarily matter how small something is or how much it weighs. It's how much density it has. Because if it mattered how much something weighed, you would think the light bobby pin would float, but it sinks. Okay, so you're probably thinking, well, what about boats? So boats have this thing called displacement whenever they're placed into the water. Displacement is when an item is placed into the water, like the boat, and the water actually moves out of the way to make room for it. And if the ship can push away more water than its own weight, it can float. Also, if you look at this diagram, ships also have air in them. So since the air is less dense than water, it allows it to float. If the air wasn't in the ship, it wouldn't be able to float because it needs to be less dense than water to float. So I'm sure some of you might have heard of the Titanic, but if not, we're going to talk about it today. So they began building the Titanic in 1909, and it actually was completed in 1912, and then it set sail from England to America on April 12th, 1912. Now, you might think that the ship just carried some rich people or people that could afford a nice luxury trip, but that's not true. It actually had rich, poor, and middle-class passengers, which is people that aren't necessarily rich or poor, they're just in between. And a lot of these people that were like the middle class and the lower class, they were hoping to go to America for a better life. Whereas the people that were rich, a lot of them were just looking at this as a vacation, a luxury, because the Titanic was considered a dream ship, and it even had really nice luxury items for these rich people on board. It had lots of restaurants, it had a ballroom, it had a heated swimming pool, it had elevators, it had a whole lot of stuff. So you're trying to think, well, how big exactly was the Titanic? Well, the Titanic was huge, and when it was built in 1912, it was actually the biggest ship ever built. The Titanic actually had 9 different levels for the passengers on board. The upper levels were for the richer passengers, and the lower levels were for the poorer passengers. Everyone thought that the Titanic was an unsinkable ship because of how it was built. They actually planned for it to be able to withhold water coming in, and that's why they have the different levels on it. They also, just because of this, did not carry enough lifeboats for everyone on board. They only carried enough lifeboats for about half of the people on board. And this is how big the Titanic is. It's actually almost as big as 3 football fields. So imagine that. You know how big a football field is? Imagine 3 of those. That's how long the Titanic was. It was a really big ship. Okay, so you're probably wondering, what went wrong to the Titanic? I know a lot of you know the Titanic sunk. So the captain received messages that icebergs were in the water, but he decided he didn't want to slow the ship down because they might not make it to New York in America on time if he did. And he thought the ship was unsinkable, so there wasn't really a point. But unfortunately, before they could steer the ship out of the way, they hit the iceberg, and we're going to see what happened with that. Here's a video about what happened.
15 years now. Let's make it 23 degrees.
Oh, absolutely. Okay. I'm happy to do it. Yeah.
All right, let's put this to bed.
There we go.
All right, that looks good. Ship's veering to port. Go 22 knots. Sideswipes the iceberg. Murdoch ports around the iceberg. Try to keep from hitting the propellers. That looks pretty good. Okay, so now we're watching in accelerated time. We see the first 5 compartments flood. They equalize pretty quickly. Bows pulled down. We see the port list. Port list looks right. Now looks like about 9 degrees. Well, you can really see the effect of that list on the flooding. So yeah, superstructure starts to get pulled under. Funnels collapse at their base. Now the bow is accelerating downward. That looks good. We're starting to see the stern come up. We got our maximum peak stress, and yeah, boom, brakes. Okay, bow swinging down. That looks good. The double keel hang on, and then they separate. Bow plunges straight down. All right, we got mast snapping back. The funnels are ripping backwards, pulling off all the davits. Bow's going down like a torpedo. Here's the angle when it falls through into a stable position. Let's see the stern. Heeling way over to port. That looks right. And she goes, yep, that's right. She goes almost vertical just when she goes under, and then boom, implodes. Now she accelerates, and all the stuff starts to rip off. See the shell plating going. There goes the double bottom frisbeeing off. And the stern's falling through. So now the stern's falling aft end down, and we see the spiraling. Here comes the bow. Bow is falling in a stable position, and it hits. Yeah, boom! It kind of breaks its back, and we see the hydraulic outburst and the downblast effect. Let's see the stern. We see the shell plating blowing off, decks, everything kind of settling around it. Looks like a big airplane crash site. Bada bing, bada boom.
Okay, so hopefully that helped you understand a little bit more about what happened with the Titanic. So, now we're going to... You're probably thinking, well, this boat should have had density, right? We just learned that boats have density, and that's what keeps them from sinking. Well, unfortunately, the Titanic was filling with so much water that the air that was keeping it afloat escaped the boat. And if air is replaced with water, the ship and the water are going to be more dense than the ocean water it's in. So it's going to sink, unfortunately. Alright, so now I want to see what you guys learned about these different topics. I want you to see if you know if it sinks or floats. So if it sinks, I want you to put your thumbs down. If it floats, I want you to put your thumbs up. A rock. Do you think a rock will sink or float? Is the rock's density more than the water or less dense than the water? You should be putting your thumb down. The rock will sink in the water. The rock is more dense than water. A pair of scissors. A pair of scissors. We should be putting our thumb down for these. Scissors will sink in water because, again, they are less dense than the water. And finally, we have an apple. What do you think is going to happen to the apple? Awesome. So, the apple is going to float, so your thumb should be up. Awesome. Thank you, guys. So we're going to go into one last experiment. Alright, scientists, I have one more experiment for you to think about. So, I have this glass of water, and I also have some oil. If I pour this oil in the glass of water, what do you think is going to happen? Think about things of sinking and floating. Do you think that it will sink or it will float in the water? Okay, so now we're actually going to find out what happens. So, I'm going to take my oil and I'm going to pour it in the water. Now you can see what's happening. Do you see the oil? What's happening to the oil? It's floating on top of the water. What does that mean about the oil if you compare it to the water? What is the oil's density like compared to the water's density? If something floats on top of the water, is it more or less dense than water? That means it's less dense than water. We just learned that if something floats on top of the water surface, that means it's less dense than water, and that's how it floats. So you can try this at home if you want. You can take a cup of water and you can pour oil into the cup yourself so you can see for yourself that oil is less dense than water and it will float. Alright, scientists, thank you for your time. I encourage you to explore all of your surroundings and see things that will float and sink and determine their density. I want you to predict what will happen to things before you actually try to sink or float them, and then find out what happens. See you later, scientists.